Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. There are stories whispered in the dark corners of American history that most people will never hear. Stories that seem too grotesque, too impossible to have ever taken place on our soil, and yet they are real. Tonight we peel back one of those buried tales, a girl who should have been a daughter, but was forced to become a wife, a bride not chosen by love, nor by fate, but by blood, forced to marry her own father in one of the most disturbing accounts of inbreeding ever documented in the United States. It begins in a forgotten town, tucked deep inside the backroads of Appalachia, a place where the hills echo with silence, and where outsiders rarely dared to venture. Generations of families lived there, rarely leaving, rarely marrying beyond their kin. Poverty clung to the land like a curse, and with it came secrecy, shame, and twisted traditions that bred both physical deformity and psychological despair. It is here that the story of the inbred bride begins. She was born into a family already marked by whispers. Her father was a stern man, known for keeping to himself and ruling his household with an iron fist. Her mother was distant, faded, almost like a shadow drifting through the home. From the moment she was old enough to walk, neighbors noticed how her father kept her close, too close. What at first appeared to be a protective father-daughter bond soon revealed itself as something darker, something that would shatter the boundaries of morality and nature itself. By the time she was a teenager, rumors were already spreading that her father saw her as more than his child. Neighbors, trapped in the suffocating web of silence that hung over, but the town dared not intervene. This was a place where secrets rotted in plain sight, and where everyone knew better than to question another man's household. Then came the wedding. No church bells, no guests from afar, just a grim gathering, forced smiles, and the unsettling reality that this young girl was no longer simply his daughter. She was his bride. This is not folklore, this is not myth, this is the buried truth of America's most inbred bride. The immediate aftermath of the marriage was nothing short of a living nightmare. To the outside world, the family continued their ordinary, isolated existence, raising crops, tending livestock, and keeping the day-to-day rituals that masked the horror within. But inside the home, the boundaries of childhood and adulthood had been erased. She was now expected to behave as both daughter and wife, roles that no human should ever be forced to navigate. Every interaction was a cruel reminder of the unnatural arrangement she had been thrust into. Historians who have studied cases like hers often describe the psychological toll of inbreeding families not in terms of genetics alone, but in the devastating distortion of social norms. In this household, affection became a weapon, control a method of survival. Her father, increasingly isolated and protective of his secret, exercised absolute authority over every detail of her life, what she ate, where she went, even how she thought. Neighbors later recalled seeing her wandering the fields alone, her eyes distant, as if part of her mind had already retreated to a world beyond the reach of her father's cruelty. Medical reports, obtained decades later by investigative journalists, revealed the grim reality of genetic inbreeding. Children born from such unions were prone to deformities, chronic illnesses, and mental instability. In this family, these signs were present across generations, yet were hidden carefully under layers of secrecy. The girl herself was physically fragile, her features subtly marked by the strain of generations of closed-line breeding. Yet the greatest suffering was not in her body, it was in her mind, trapped in a cycle she had no power to escape. Some accounts suggest that she tried in small ways to assert her independence. She would disappear into the woods for hours, staring at the distant hills, imagining a life where she could breathe without fear, without the constant shadow of her father looming over her. But in a town where isolation was both physical and psychological, escape was nearly impossible. Friends were few, family loyalty was law, and outsiders dared not intervene. To anyone else it looked like a family bound by circumstance, but beneath the surface there was a slow, grinding torment that no one could see, or admit. And then, as the years passed, the grim inevitability of the situation became clearer. She was not simply living a childhood stolen, she was living a life shaped entirely by the will of a man who should have been her protector, not her captor. Every day was a testament to silence, compliance, and fear. This was a household where love was twisted into control, and where generations of secrecy ensured that the truth would remain buried, hidden from the broader world. The town around them, small and insular, played its role in this silent horror. Outsiders rarely entered, and when they did, they were politely turned away or left unnerved by the strange, watchful eyes of the family. For years, neighbors whispered behind closed doors, their curiosity suppressed by fear. There was an unspoken understanding. The family's affairs were theirs alone, and to pry too deeply could bring consequences far worse than shame. Historians who have examined these isolated communities often describe them as self-contained ecosystems, where social rules are dictated less by law and more by survival. Bloodlines were sacred, marriages were controlled, and secrets were fiercely protected. In such a system, deviations, no matter how morally or biologically abhorrent, were tolerated, even encouraged, as long as they preserved the family's cohesion. And this girl's fate was, tragically, the result of that very logic. Her adolescence passed like a fog. School was rare. Education was deemed less important than obedience. Any attempt to assert herself was met with subtle threats or cruel punishments. Her father, increasingly obsessive, ensured that no one outside the home could influence her thoughts, her actions, or her understanding of the world. Over time, she became quiet, withdrawn, her personality folding in on itself like a flower deprived of sunlight. Yet beneath the silence, a spark of awareness persisted. She understood, with growing horror, that her life had been hijacked by a patriarchal obsession that had nothing to do with love. The family's physical isolation mirrored a psychological isolation that was far more sinister. Every visitor who arrived at the home, whether a mail carrier or a distant relative, was carefully screened. Any hint of suspicion could provoke immediate retaliation. Neighbors would later admit that even casual conversation was turned, but the family carried an undertone of unease, as if the house itself radiated a warning, "Do not enter." And while the father maintained control over every visible aspect of her life, the internal damage was profound. Studies of inbreeding families reveal that victims often experience intense cognitive dissonance. Love and fear become inseparable, trust is impossible, and the mind begins to warp in an effort to survive. She learned to navigate this delicate balance, internalizing guilt, shame, and obedience as though they were natural. Yet despite the crushing weight of her circumstances, there were moments of quiet resistance. Moments where she dared to imagine an alternative life. Moments where the outside world, however distant, seemed like a fragile thread she could cling to. But each hope was tempered by reality, each dream shadowed by the knowledge that her cage had no key. As she entered her late teens, the stakes of her reality grew even darker. The marriage to her father, once hidden behind hushed murmurs and carefully constructed excuses, began to take its full toll. The community, whether out of fear or moral resignation, remained silent. Their avoidance only reinforced the cycle of abuse, allowing the father to exert absolute authority without interference. Each day, the line between familial duty and coerced submission blurred further, leaving her trapped in a world no one else could understand. Psychologists studying such cases note that the human mind, when subjected to prolonged captivity within toxic family systems, adapts in unsettling ways. She became hyper-aware of her environment, reading her father's moods with the precision of someone who knows that a single misstep could invite punishment. Normal teenage rebellion, questions, small acts of defiance, or even attempts at self-expression were perceived as threats to the fragile equilibrium that her father maintained. Over time, these adaptive behaviors became survival instincts, embedding fear and obedience so deeply that they shaped her very identity. Meanwhile, the father's obsession escalated. Accounts suggest that he began to enforce strict rituals, controlling not only her movements but her interactions with the natural world. Fields had to be worked according to his schedule. Meals were consumed in silence. Any deviation was met with sharp reprimands or, at times, physical force. The household itself seemed like a carefully constructed machine designed to break her spirit, and in many ways, it succeeded. The bright curiosity of childhood had long since vanished, replaced by a hollow vigilance that left her mind constantly scanning for danger. Yet, despite the trauma, she retained an almost imperceptible sense of hope, small, fleeting, like a candle flickering in a pitch black room. At night, when the house was quiet and the world outside seemed impossibly far away, she would whisper her dreams to herself, dreams of freedom, of a life untouched by the grotesque bond that had defined her existence. In these moments, she was not a daughter, not a bride, not a victim, but simply herself, the part of her that the father could never fully claim. It is in these quiet, hidden moments that we glimpse the resilience of the human spirit. Even when subjected to the most extreme forms of psychological manipulation and abuse, the mind clings to fragments of autonomy, fragments of self. And it is this duality, terror and endurance, control and rebellion, that makes her story so haunting. It is a testament to the darkness that can flourish in isolation, and to the fragile glimmers of humanity that persist even in the most unnatural circumstances. By the time she reached adulthood, the full horror of her situation became impossible to ignore. Every aspect of her life had been meticulously orchestrated by her father, a man whose obsession had transformed from protective to pathological. To the outside world, they remained a quiet, secluded family, their interactions seemingly normal, almost mundane, but behind closed doors, the boundaries between parent and spouse had long since dissolved, leaving her trapped in a role no human should ever endure. It was during these years that the psychological and physical consequences of generations of inbreeding became starkly apparent. Reports and medical documents later uncovered describe subtle yet undeniable features passed down through generations: asymmetrical facial structures, stunted growth, and other congenital conditions that were silently masked in public, but impossible to hide entirely. These markers served as a haunting reminder of a bloodline slowly corroding from within, each generation compounding the trauma of the last. Her life was governed by routines so rigid they were almost ritualistic. Meals were taken in silence. Sleep was dictated by his schedule. Any attempt to assert independence, even in the smallest ways, was met with intimidation, coercion, or punishment. Friends, mentors, and anyone who could have been a lifeline were carefully kept at bay. Isolation became a weapon, and fear became her constant companion. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? This is the kind of moral and psychological labyrinth that few could imagine navigating. Yet it was her reality every single day. Even in her moments of despair, she maintained a silent awareness that her life was unlike any other, a knowledge that her suffering was both deeply personal and horrifyingly universal, a reflection of the darkest capacities within human families. Historians studying similar cases emphasize the duality of such experiences. On one hand, there is the physical confinement and abuse. On the other, the quiet but unyielding endurance of the human spirit. She learned through years of suffering to navigate a world where every word, gesture, and thought was monitored, controlled, and exploited. And in doing so, she preserved the smallest vestiges of autonomy, which became her lifeline. Her story, though obscured by time and fear, leaves us with haunting questions about the nature of family, the boundaries of morality, and the silent tragedies that can unfold in the shadows of society. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that horror is not always external, that trauma can be inherited, and that some stories are kept hidden not because they are forgotten, but because they are too disturbing to face. As the years dragged on, the girl, now a woman, faced a grim reality. Her father's control was absolute, and escape seemed impossible. Every attempt at asserting independence, every fleeting moment of defiance, was met with subtle but unmistakable intimidation. The walls of her home were not merely physical barriers, they were instruments of psychological imprisonment. In these circumstances, the human mind begins to bend, reshaping itself to survive. She learned to anticipate danger, to read unspoken threats, to silence any thought that might provoke retaliation. Yet, even within this suffocating environment, traces of resistance persisted. Small acts, almost invisible to the casual observer, became her way of asserting a fragile sense of self. A hidden journal, a stolen moment in the woods, or the quiet observation of the world beyond her father's domain allowed her to maintain a connection to life as it might have been. These private rituals were both sanctuary and rebellion, a testament to her resilience, however precarious. The family's inbreeding created more than psychological strain. It left undeniable marks on the body as well. Medical records obtained decades later detail the hereditary consequences: weakened immune systems, cognitive challenges, and distinctive physical traits. These were not merely genetic anomalies, they were living evidence of generations of isolation, secrecy, and twisted familial loyalty. Yet, despite the compounding trauma, she survived, navigating a landscape designed to crush her identity. Historians who examine such cases emphasize the corrosive effects of secrecy. In isolated communities, social norms can warp in dangerous ways. Families like hers develop internal codes of conduct where abuse becomes normalized and silence becomes survival. In this environment, she was both victim and participant, forced to internalize a world where horror was normalized and escape was nearly impossible. And yet, even amid this darkness, there are moments that reveal the complexity of human endurance. She learned to cope, to navigate, to exist without fully surrendering. Each day became a delicate balance between compliance and preservation of self. Every whispered thought, every imagined future was a defiance against the reality imposed upon her. And it is in this interplay between oppression and endurance that her story becomes profoundly human. The more we uncover about her life, the more it forces us to confront unsettling questions. How many other stories have been hidden behind the quiet facades of towns like hers? How many families harbor secrets too disturbing to discuss? And most importantly, what can we learn about the strength of the human spirit when faced with horrors no one should ever endure? Eventually, the full weight of her life, a life dictated by blood, secrecy, and control, became impossible to ignore. She had survived, yes, but at a cost few could truly comprehend. Her identity had been molded by the twisted hands of her father, her body marked by generations of inbreeding, her mind sharpened by constant vigilance and fear. Yet, through all of this, she endured, a living testament to the fragility and resilience of human existence. After decades, fragments of her story began to emerge. Investigators, historians, and journalists piecing together the puzzle found accounts from neighbors, letters, and even forgotten medical records. What they uncovered was both horrifying and illuminating, a story that had been deliberately erased from public memory, hidden behind a veneer of normalcy and silence. It became clear that this was not a tale of isolated cruelty, but of systemic neglect, secrecy, and the capacity of communities to turn a blind eye to the unspeakable. Her father eventually passed, leaving a complex legacy of trauma and silence. The town continued to whisper, but the horrors of the household faded into rumors, half-truths, and cautionary tales. Yet the marks on her body and psyche remained, invisible to the world, but indelible to her own experience. And it is in these quiet scars that the true horror of her story resides, not merely in the unnatural marriage, but in the lifetime of psychological manipulation and isolation that followed. Stories like hers force us to confront uncomfortable truths about history, about human behavior, and about the hidden corners of society that no one wants to acknowledge. They remind us that evil is not always sensationalized or public. It can exist quietly, in homes and communities that appear ordinary, in lives that are forgotten or intentionally ignored. Her story is a warning, a grim testament to the consequences. Ences of secrecy, control, and the dark potential within insular family systems. Yet, even in the midst of despair, her story also speaks to endurance. To survive such circumstances, to maintain fragments of self amidst relentless control, is an act of courage that defies our understanding. She remains, in a way, unbroken, her existence a haunting reminder that even in the most extreme conditions, the human spirit can endure. So, as we leave this story behind, remember, the past holds truths that are often too uncomfortable to face, but in uncovering them, we glimpse the resilience of those who lived through them. The tale of America's most inbred bride is not merely a story of horror, it is a story of survival, secrecy, and the hidden depths of human endurance.